Hello and welcome to Pop Screen, part of the Geek Show podcast network. We look at the good, the bad, and the bizarre of movies, either starring about or by pop stars. No, the podcast covers just a broad range of musical and cinematic genres, from country and western to hip hop, from documentaries to science fiction. I'm your host, Graham Williamson. I'm a writer for the Geek Show, Byline Times, and we are Cult, and I'm also a short filmmaker and visual artist. I've been joined this week by a co-host who is a journalist, a quizmaster, a podcaster, and he's white. It's Mark Harrison.
He's a podcaster and he's white. Hello, how are you doing, Graham?
How do you think that intro will be received by people who haven't seen this particular movie?
Yeah, that's a whole thing, isn't it? Yeah, massive spoilers for Elvis from here on out. Yeah, go rush. If you've got 2 hours 45 minutes spare, go watch Elvis and come back.
Well, that is the thing, isn't it? I fought shy of watching this film for a long time, in part because, like all blockbusters, you have to rearrange your entire day nowadays around just seeing it once. But it's also, the controversial figure at the heart of it, beloved by some, referred to as the king of rock and roll for his number one singles, but also criticised for cultural appropriation and sheer garish bad taste. So, Mark, what do you think of Baz Luhrmann?
Saw it coming, but I enjoyed it anyway. Yeah, so the Marmite of this, I suppose, would be Baz Luhrmann. That there's people going all the way back to, certainly there's people who think there's a tail off around Australia, the Great Gatsby, and things like that. Like, going further back, people just weren't into his takes on, on Romeo and Juliet or Moulin Rouge. For me, I've never minded Baz Luhrmann. It's a maximalist style. And when
Yeah.
you hear he's doing an Elvis film, that sounds about right. What my Marmite thing is for this particular episode is that I really can't stand most music biopics, which is odd given we've been on this show quite a lot. But the
Yeah.
traditional music biopic, your Bohemian Rhapsodies and to a lesser extent Walk the Line really wind me up. There are exceptions, but Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story is one of my favourite comedies for a reason, and it's not because it's affectionate about what it's spoofing. But this is a film that I went to go see when it came out in the cinema, and it's grown on me over the last year or so. It's been out. I've revisited it, and the more I think about it, kind of the more I like it, if I'm honest. What was your experience of it?
Well, I did not want to see this for the longest time. I've had a problematic relationship with Baz Luhrmann ever since my English teacher showed me Romeo and Juliet, which is obviously the worst way to be introduced to any film. If you show it in class, you'll never enjoy it. That's the rules.
Yeah, but for English, they did sort of fill the gap. Like, it was The Crucible.
Yeah.
Let's study the novel The Crucible, and then, oh, thank God, Romeo and Juliet, a film has come out we can watch. It did seem overtake, didn't it? Yeah.
Yes, I've tried many times to get all the way through Moulin Rouge. I cannot. And after that, I just wrote him off, really. I just heard about things he was doing and thought, well, that doesn't sound very interesting. And that was how I felt about Elvis. But you insisted, I think, that there was definitely a pop screen episode in this. And you know what? When it started, I had this moment of thinking, why is this edited like the counting before the trailer? Why do I expect there to be a caption saying Elvis trailer begins in 5, 4, 3, 2? And maybe it's Stockholm syndrome, but as it moved through the first hour, I started to get this weird sensation that I was really enjoying a Baz Luhrmann film. And like
Mm.
you, the more I think about it, the more I think, yeah, I did.
Well, for me, it was a thing of when I went to see this on the cinema first time around,
Mm,
and in the cinema I thought, right, this really gets good in the second half. Like I wasn't with it through the first hour, but again, as you say, I've gone back and I've like learned, I've come to appreciate it because I think once you know what he's doing with this film,
mm,
I think it's revelatory on a second to go around, and I think if you primed going in, knowing that it's not actually really a biopic of Elvis Presley, the person, it's Colonel Tom Parker's final fever dream, as
yes.
as Tom Hanks playing Elvis's infamous manager, like
Mm.
Colonel Tom Parker. And what this film actually is like it's Amadeus if Salieri had even more main character syndrome, or Hamilton if Hamilton opened with Aaron Burr saying, "Actually, America shot him," and telling his version about how he's just a little guy, he's just an innocent little guy who's never done anything wrong. Added to all of this, he's. I remember when this premiered at Cannes, and the line that came out before I even saw the film, and it's impossible to shake once you've heard it. David Ehrlich from IndieWire, in his review of the film at Cannes, said that Tom Hanks was playing a kind of Kentucky Fried Gold member. And once you've heard
Yes.
that, that's really all. It's this Flemish accent. It's this really peculiar performance,
Well,
but it's
that
not.
was the thing, yeah, because
Yeah,
the first time I saw anything from it, and the thing that persuaded me that maybe I won't be seeing this initially, is
yeah.
the first trailer, and it has this
Hmm.
unfortunate beat where it starts, and if you're clued in, certainly I think because it opens with a flurry of production logos, one of which is Baz Luhrmann's typically understated uh, production company logo.
Hmm.
You recognise that this is the Elvis movie you've heard so much about, and the opening, the first thing you hear is, "Some people think I am the villain of this story," and you think, "Oh, oh, that can't be his Elvis voice, can it?" It's like,
Is that the voice Austin Butler is stuck with now? Do you know it?
because like I was flawed by it, but because like most other people in the world, I had no idea that Colonel Tom Parker was from most Central European countries all at the same time.
He's a little bit he's about as American as Tommy Wiseau. Let's just say that. As someone says, and I think they actually say straight out in the film at one point, he's not a colonel, he's not a Tom, he's not a Parker. You know, he is in all ways fake, and the way that it starts digging into this is really interesting, especially when you're presented with this. As I say, the film starts from Colonel Tom Parker on his deathbed,
Yeah.
kind of reflecting upon, like, as you say, some people think I am the villain of it. There's going to be a lot of these Tom Parker impressions, or Hanks's Parker impressions throughout this. I am the snowman, and he is the showman, and all that voice.
Yes.
Like all of that's going on, but he starts from the beginning, kind
Mm.
of framing it as if like it's a murder mystery, like from his point of view. Like, let's say I killed him. I didn't kill him. I loved him. It's sounding a bit more like Tom Hardy Bane. I'll ease off on the impression, but he's going, I loved him, and I know who did it. And the conclusion that comes to at the end of this, this odyssey is oh, maddening, because it's a thing of like, there's people go, oh, it's portraying him in a sympathetic light, and it's like, no, watch it critically.
Mm.
What
Yeah.
he's telling us in the narration is absolutely contradicted by his actions, and
Yes.
what the dramatization of it is more based on the biography and everything that's come out about him since. But what the film brilliantly does, and one of the ways it gets around my hackles are up about biopics,
Mm.
is that it is an unreliable narrator. It's an unreliable account. There's a big vibe of, as Alan Partridge says in his autobiography, needless to say, I had the last laugh. It's a lot of hagiography from a character in the film who's the motherfucking devil. Like, just
Yes.
because it's Tom Hanks, they're not portraying him as a sympathetic character. It's Tom Hanks playing it against type magnificently, like eccentrically, certainly, but the character kind of requires that. I think, like, in a less competitive Best Supporting Actor field, he probably would have been in the running, but that might say more about the Best Supporting Actor history than it does about anything else. It works for me, is what I'm saying. It works
Oh
for
yeah,
this angle on this film.
yeah, absolutely. It kept reminding me of something that a friend of mine said. I think he now says he can't remember saying this, but it's always stuck in my head at least. That a friend of mine was, I think he was reading the book Last Train to Memphis, that this is
Yeah,
sort of loosely inspired by, which is a huge, real landmark tome on Elvis's life and history. And he said, I like everything about Elvis except the music. Now, I think if you do like the music, there's plenty here that's going to entertain you. There's certainly an awful lot of Elvis's music in it, but it is also a film about the myth of Elvis, and the myth in this instance is Faust. You know, Elvis is the young boy who was tempted by this devil and sold his soul, and that's the role Colonel Tom Parker's playing. He's the Mephistopheles of this.
yeah, I couldn't agree more, because it's just the thing that America is so new in the history of the world that its
Mm,
pop culture is its mythology.
yeah.
Once you move past westerns and you've gone through the golden age and the silver age and the deconstruction and the reconstruction of all of that, Elvis isn't. Again, this is another thing that gets past my usual guards against music biopics. Elvis isn't Freddie Mercury or Johnny Cash. He's King Arthur or Robin Hood
Yes,
in
yeah,
this. So, the Captain Marvel and Shazam
yeah.
imagery. Like, it is Captain Marvel in the comics, I guess, but Shazam is for if you're one of the film lads. Imagery, with like his fandom of that as a kid, and the Colonel Tom then picks up and says, "We are going to the Rock of Eternity," and all this stuff. Baz Luhrmann in interviews with Entertainment Weekly when the film came out compared this treatment of Elvis to like Shakespeare's histories, the way that Shakespeare would focus on a figure and then say stuff about what was going on, like make
Yeah,
a drama around the history of the time. So I guess he's also Henry VIII as well as King Arthur in this, but like this is how Luhrmann treats Elvis. Elvis, the characters in it, it is a all snark aside, it is a good performance by Austin Butler,
oh
but it's
god,
doing
yeah.
this while absolutely excoriating like the industry vested in, as I mentioned, the motherfucking devil himself that
Yes.
exploited him and in turn exploited black music.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Because one of the things I was genuinely like, I genuinely believed this was going to flop. And I think if you go back to Rob and me's podcast that we did for this show about The Dead
Hmm.
Don't Die, which is the other Austin Butler movie that we've done
Oh
on
yeah,
this, we agreed that this was guaranteed to flop because how the hell do you make a movie about a white guy exploiting black music in the 50s, in the segregation era, in 2022?
yeah,
And I think it's something the film does well. It's unquestionably pushing the case for the defense. I think you could certainly make a counter argument against it. It is very partial in terms of the ways that Elvis respected and valued black people and black music, but I don't think it's unconvincing.
yeah. It's again. I mean, the answer to how you do this in 2022 is you do it critically, which is what the film does. It has
Yeah.
the perspective. Like, again, you've got Colonel Tom wanging on over the top of everything, like mythologizing, like as if
Mm.
he's almost like it's that his superhero origin story is these born equidistant places between a gospel tent and a juke joint that's like sent up as like the sacred and the profane and all this kind of thing. But it's
Yes.
like the character's viewpoint in that isn't Tom Parker's. So it's very walk hard, the moment where, as we alluded to earlier on, Colonel Tom Parker has the idea for Elvis Presley to be white. Which would be, good God, it's like in any other thing. It's like, here, I've got an idea. What if we clap and go, and like the audience can play along with it, and it's shit like that, self mythologizing. This is from some distance and put through the prism of someone who absolutely is exploiting it. And that like there's a bit early on, isn't it? That's true, isn't it? The thing that they had the merchandise, like the Elvis merchandise,
Yes.
where it kind of comes out like that one bit of Mel Brooks in Spaceballs going, Spaceballs the flamethrower, Spaceballs the breakfast cereal, sort of thing. But like, not only just I love Elvis badges, but I hate Elvis badges because these will
Yeah.
also sell, and it becomes about that. And that it does, while it's from his perspective, the objective stuff that's in there from his, what we actually see of his actions is him dismissing it because we can't put a black singer on the hayride until he finds out he's not. And it's like, oh, good. Well, we can monetize that then. It's
Yeah.
ridiculous.
This is the moment at which the film started to reel me in. I had seen that he's white moment clipped on social media, and
Yeah.
like a lot of film clips that go viral on social media, it looks funny if you take like no account of context or the style that the film has established
Mm-hmm.
into account. It's not a great method of criticizing films, I think. But
No.
anyway, when it's in that kind of carnival roadside Americana kind of vibe, I grew up on David Lynch and the X-Files. Of course, I love that shit.
Mm.
But I found that really seductive. But it also emphasizes, as you say, that the birth of rock and roll as a global cultural phenomenon is rooted in this kind of tacky freak show exploitation. Tom Parker is a volcanically tasteless man, but he knows the public. No one else could have thought of that. I love Elvis, I hate Elvis. Anyone else around that time would have thought, well, if people hate our star, that's a liability. Maybe we ought to soften his image up. And indeed, he does do that a bit later. But at that moment, you are seeing the birth of modern PR. This idea that it's actually good to do something divisive because people talk about it. And if you can make money off the people who hate the person you're representing, even better.
Yeah, he talks about calling himself the Snowman, and
Mm.
aside from his affinity for Christmas specials, it's just about the snow job, isn't it? That he just baldly just says like, "Oh yeah, this is the thing we do. We just empty the Rube's wallet and leave them with nothing but a smile on their face."
Yeah.
Which is in turn what he does to Elvis. It's like
Yeah.
while certain bits of this are dramatized, like the bit later on in the film where he's on stage in Vegas and has a meltdown and fires him didn't happen the way that
Mm.
it happened. But look at right. As far as I mentioned the awards conversation already, people who love the film Tar will hate to hear this, but it's the most natural double bill of this year's Best Picture contenders. Of last year's Best Picture contenders was Elvis and Tar because they're both soaked in a character's subjectivity, mistaken for
Yeah.
objectivity by the people who've watched it, and respectively slammed and lauded for it. Elvis Presley's life wasn't quite like this, and Lydia Tarr isn't fucking real, but this is the best film. Like, this is the better of the two films. I'm sorry, it is. Well, I mean, we're not going to do a Tar episode. Neither of us can be asked, right? So,
No, absolutely not.
no,
And I
absolutely not.
don't think I don't think there is. I suppose I could say that Kate Blanchett is now, to me, a star of Sparks videos and therefore qualifies for pop screen, but it's a big reach.
We should do the Glastonbury set. just do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it does have, in the question of this, of the question of cultural appropriation,
Mm.
if manages to show the exploitation, to dramatize it, and also to show that for the character who was sincere, that he loved that he was a fan of. It does the other stock music biopic thing of like having cameos from other famous characters who he bumps
Yeah.
into along the way. Like Calvin Harrison Jr. plays BB King, Alton Mason plays Little Richard. Sorry.
Love Calvin Harrison Jr. What a great actor he is.
Oh, he's brilliant, reliably
Yeah.
good in everything. Yeah, but so again, it has these scenes in there, but I think, and I'll stop saying this is how I got around my defenses because this is what it is. Is it's doing all of those walk hard things, all of the things that any self-respecting director should like want to avoid, like the plague, after walk
Mm.
hard setting up so well. But it makes it part of the grammar of an absolutely tasteless narrator, like of
Yes.
someone who, this is like. It is a film coming out in 2022. It's like, oh, wasn't it so terrible that we exploited Elvis? But it's at least conscious of it's at least conscious of that. Like the history of this, you mentioned Last Train for Memphis,
Yeah.
which Fox got the rights for, like got the rights to adapt back in the
Okay.
90s, when
Yeah.
Colonel Tom Parker was still alive, and he was involved as a consultant, partly because he kept hold of the image and music rights. So in
Mm.
1996, it was announced that he was on as a consultant. He died in 1997, and the film kind of developed away from what they were doing there. But that was going to be a film about his early career up until he was drafted. And you can just imagine it, can't you? You can just imagine that it's
Yes.
about the rise to fame, about how like he was a he was a bad boy, but the army straightened him out. Like the army was, if anything, the making of him. Like, and that's actually really why he was. You can just, I mean, who's
Yeah.
playing Colonel Tom in like the airbrushed 1990s version? It's probably Kevin Costner, isn't it? It's
Oh God,
probably,
yeah, definitely. Yeah.
it's probably, yeah. It's like that's what you've got, but it's that I found that out while researching for this, and that's fascinating to me because there's other many despicable things about his management and his exploitation of Elvis,
Mm.
but like it's the fact that he was there in the beginning of what this film could have been, and that it didn't pan out is like, whew, just dodged a bullet.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Some intervention from benevolent movie gods there. But you mentioned that sort of depiction of the young Elvis as being like in between the church and the Duke joint and
Hmm.
finding an excuse for him to literally run from one into another.
Yeah.
And that's part of how Luhrmann's style got past my defenses. You know, if we're talking about the main thing that I was worried about going into it.
Yeah.
Um, because Luhrmann likes to do this thing where he mashes things up and he uses anachronistic music and he layers sort of different images onto each other. And in theory, I like that. In practice, it normally sort of emphasizes how little he has to say about his subjects. You know, the nadir being Great Gatsby, where he says, "Oh well, you know, back in the day, jazz was the party music, and now it's hip hop. So I'm going to do 1920s parties with Jay-Z rapping over it." And you think, congratulations, that has somehow found nothing to say about jazz or hip hop, to be honest. You know, a
Yeah.
massively reductive take on what both of those musical forms are. But when you see Elvis on stage playing That's All Right, and you have these really brief but powerful flashbacks to him hearing an old blues man sing it and him hearing a gospel choir next door singing at the same time. That manages to make the case for Elvis as a respectful interpreter of black music far more eloquently than like any dialogue scene trying to establish that would have been incredibly cringy. And there are a few moments later on in the film which hew close, but Luhrmann's taste for anachronism and
Mm.
layering is very focused on one thing here, and it's all for the better. I'd always thought of him as like the hip teacher of Hollywood. You know, he's the
Mm.
guy who says, in a lot of ways, Wordsworth was the Kanye of his day, and I don't want to pay £10 to hear something like that. But you know, in this case, for all he's expressing it in an idiosyncratic and a personal way, everything he's saying about rock and roll and the blues and eventually hip hop is true, is obviously true. He's just finding a really lively and to the point way of saying it.
Yeah, where it works here as opposed to um, in Gatsby, where it's more an anachronism, is that this is
Yeah,
pop culture as tapestry. You know, it's like
yeah,
it's all, you know, there's events that slide around in the timeline. The songs that it doesn't quite go as far as like Rocket Man. It's not a jukebox musical where
mm,
we dramatize stuff by Elvis suddenly singing while he's just walking down the street or something. You could
yeah,
argue in some ways it's covering up certain aspects of the adaptation, like the bit where he's sat with Priscilla, and you sort of have a contemporary cover, more contemporary to now cover of "Can't Help Falling in Love" playing. It's like, well, Priscilla was 14, but Casey Musgraves wasn't even born, so we're just gonna we've squared that circle. We're just gonna slide right past that. It's like, also the song wasn't written yet, but you know, it's like that's where it covers things like that. But it is, as I said, it's you get these moments apart from Colonel Tom
mm,
that even though like it might even be how he's in his imagining, because one of the things this came in for criticism for was that it glosses over, like it sort of covers all of his movie career in one thing that's almost like a trailer, like
yeah,
montage,
yeah,
as if you can distinguish anything from this is, you know, a giant hyper, you know, hyper montage, fever dream sort of style all the way through, anyway, for the entire nearly 3 hours. So there's that. So
Yeah.
it kind of like jumps through that, and he kind of says like, "I made him into a movie star in his own life. We're starring Priscilla and all of his friends," and it's sort of veering into Edna Mode now. This impression. This is why Hanks deserves the Oscar and I don't. Yeah, it's this thing that like, as much as it's fast moving and maximalist, it's detailed. You find
Yeah. Yeah.
detail in the, whether it's the quiet moments of Elvis and Priscilla together, they're absolutely, never mind the introductory scene, the final scene of the two of them together is absolutely shattering. Like the line where it's referring back to something they say earlier on, and Butler says like, "I'm all out with dreams," and it's the last line, his last line in the film. It's, the other thing about this, I don't know about the thing about making it in 2022. I think the other thing is like sorry, I've lost my train of thought there. Sorry. The other thing about marketing in 2022 is that when people came over, some of the reaction was like, "Oh, it was kind of sad." It's like, yeah, it's an absolutely colossal bummer because his life was, the man died at 42. It's like there's no happy version of this. Like, there's no version of, well, you get an AIDS diagnosis, but now I've done live AIDS, so it's okay. I'm the best. Like, just to fudge that around. Like there's fudging and rearranging of history for drama, but it's purposeful. Like it's a film that if it wasn't so well edited, it's a film that has David Wenham and Richard Roxburgh in the same movie, but keeps them apart so it doesn't explode because of the Blinovitch limitation effect. Because I've always thought they were the same person. Like it has David Wenham in it as Hanks, as the dad, I think, as Elvis's dad, and then Richard Roxburgh as Hank Snow. Although it might be the other way around now that I've said that. I'm not even doing that on purpose. It might be the other way around. But
Originally, the parents were going to be Maggie Gyllenhaal and Rufus Sewell, but when production had to be held up because of Hanks's COVID diagnosis, they had to drop out. I think that would have been good. I'd have loved to see Maggie Gyllenhaal in this movie.
Yeah, that feels a little more in the vein of like, casting Bryce Dallas Howard as Elton John's mum, like as a casting choice goes. I quite liked Helen Thompson in this. I thought that was a lovely touch. Because
I thought it was a lovely touch, although the bit after the death scene did kind of, I had a thought that ruptured the tragedy of that moment slightly when Colonel Tom Parker comes into Elvis's room and says, "From now on, I will do anything your mother did for you." And I just wanted Elvis to look up and say, "Would you fuck my dad?"
And I did. I fucked that young boy's dad. I fucked that young boy's daddy because I was his manager. Good grief. Oh. Well, that's plate smashing noise. That's that shattered in my head. Well, anyway.
Moving on.
But the other thing I wanted to say is so it doesn't go quite as far as Rocket Man in its jukebox musical but there's some stellar use of the songbook here, like the much celebrated Viva Las Vegas Toxic mashup that was the kind of came out from the trailers and was like, if it's going to get the TikTokers in, then good.
Yeah,
but that's fine. But then in terms of performance, again, Austin Butler is very good. It's not for me to say that his claiming to have changed his voice forever was part of the performance, and it probably wore off the Monday after Brendan Fraser won the Oscar instead. But I would mind more if he wasn't also great. He's very good. I think it's all him up until the very last thing where it's him miming to Elvis perform, but it is still a physical performance. But not to get ahead of myself. So in between, there's the Suspicious Minds scene, which I think is brilliant. It's like it could be such a hoary old cliche that it's happening, and it's intercut with, Colonel Tom signing his life away. Signing his life away on a napkin. But it's kind of arranged to condense time. You realize you're watching it. It's like a Christopher Nolan like device almost. It's like it's all an audio montage. It's happening. It's the same song, but as it goes on, it grows more frantic than the original, and Elvis sounds more tired. And it's almost like you're watching it on different nights at different stages as this deal with the devil just absolutely burns him out. It's spanning like however long in the 5-year initial residency it's meant to cover.
Mm.
It's
It's very
staggeringly that's a bit where it clicked for me. I would say maybe it's quite late in the film, but on
yeah
first time that's the point where I was like, okay, right, I get what this is doing now.
yeah. It's very faithful, I think, to how the music feels rather than how the music is.
Yeah,
Like at the first Elvis concert, he brought in is it I can never pronounce this because it's got an accent on it, and I don't know whether it's a hard rock superfluous accent or whether it's actual. But Maneskin.
Manskin. Yeah,
Yeah, he brought them in to kind of soup up the first song he does. You think obviously that's completely anachronistic to how it would have sounded, because
yeah,
in the early days of rock and roll, people were basically playing through the same tannoys that auctioneers used to use. They had no power whatsoever. But you need something that gets across to the audience. This is a new noise. This is like a racket that they've never heard before, and it does that very well, I think.
yeah. That's a brilliant way of putting it. Yeah, exactly that. Because if you're not coming to this off of having heard the Viva Las Vegas and Toxic mashup, if very familiar with Elvis's music, it still brings you into that
Yeah.
in a way that I guess some people will just recoil if the Doja Cat is on the soundtrack of an Elvis movie, but fuck them, it's good. Is what I'm saying. But yeah, it's yeah, it has all of that. It's again about, as I say, a pop culture tapestry.
Yeah.
It's and all of this, unreliable narration goes all the way through, and that people mistake it for, oh, well, it didn't even happen that way. Well, it doesn't matter. Like, for one thing, just to give one example, people go, oh, the International Hotel in Vegas didn't pay for the show. Like, he ended up paying like 80 grand a year out of his own pocket to like pay everybody. It's like, yeah, but who tells us that the hotel has offered to pay for everything? It's
Yes.
this deal is not like, we're not being. It's the ongoing media literacy crisis. Like, we're being told about this by a bastard. Like, to give another example of something that's sort of conflated together. Like, he didn't have, as I said, he didn't have that bit where he's on stage and he kind of
Mm.
goes, "You don't have a passport, you son of a bitch." Like, he doesn't have like all
Yeah,
of
yeah.
that. It's a good line. I like that line. He didn't he didn't fire Parker on stage. He did become aware of the fact that the Parker was an illegal alien in America. Was like, had never applied for a passport, according to his biography. Had never applied for a
Right.
passport in the US because the Netherlands has an extradition treaty with the US, and he was a person of interest in a murder when he was younger. He came to the US. He enlisted in the army. Was in the army for a good while. Went AWOL. Was
Mm.
captured, put in solitary confinement. Came out without a form of psychosis, as it's put, and then went on to manage one of the biggest and most influential music artists of the 20th century. So,
Yeah, who says
you know,
there isn't a second act in American lives?
yeah. So this sequence in the film that's so well done, because it's like it's Elvis's friends eventually tell him, this is why he's doing it, and it works as a twist, because I didn't know that about him. It's the fact that we could go on tour all over the world. Like, I've never left America. I want to, like, and he's never left America because he's
Yes.
not going to be fucking allowed back in.
Yeah.
Tom Parker is not going to be allowed back in. But it comes to a head with the you don't have a passport, you son of a bitch thing. The actual
Mm.
event that this is based on is, Baron Hilton, the hotel mogul, fired someone who works in the kitchen who Elvis likes. Elvis spent a lot of time in this hotel, so freaked out about it on stage. Parker had an argument with him about it afterwards, because, poor image and all the rest of it. And
Yeah.
Elvis said, "You're sacked." And there was reportedly, I wonder if this is the first person to say it, but Tom Parker said, "You can't fire me, I quit." Um, but
Another of his show landmarks
yeah,
that he was
yeah.
involved in.
There was, so basically, as set, it wasn't the sort of back and forth of expenses that's shown in the film. He basically said he
Mm.
wanted a $2 million buyout that he claimed he was owed, and
Yeah.
the two of them wound up coming to terms, more or less, and he just carried on all the way up, like, overworking him to the point where he died so young. And there's
Yeah. Yeah.
the other thing that comes out about this is that, like, the other thing that people have said about when he heard Elvis had died, Colonel Tom's just kind of like, oh well, I better, like, didn't really react. Just kind of said, I better keep going on managing him then, and was like organizing Graceland as a museum and a place of pilgrimage. Oh, the rest.
Yeah,
God, it's the I hate Elvis badges to that. There's a straight line.
it is. Yeah,
It's
yeah.
yeah, but
I don't know
it's
if you've
what
ever. Sorry.
I was just going to say. I'm repeating myself a bit, but it's what makes, because you're watching a malignant narcissist tell this story of a film called Elvis. It's not a
Yeah.
straight biopic of Elvis.
The managing him after his death reminded me of. Have you ever seen that film by Teesside's favourite daughter, Jeannie Finlay, called Orion, the Man Who Would Be King?
I haven't.
It's a really fascinating documentary about a singer in the 60s and 70s whose curse for most of his career was that he just sounded exactly like Elvis.
Right.
And then Elvis died, and that became his blessing. Suddenly, he was like cornering the market in singers who sounded like Elvis but weren't dead. And they actually created a gimmick where they put this stupid mask on him and had him give interviews where he said, let's not. I don't want to talk about my past. I've recently had some big changes in my life, and tried to drop hints that he was in fact
Mm,
Elvis.
yeah.
And a lot of the people who were involved in making these records were people from, I think, studios where Elvis had recorded. And you think, wow, nobody blinked here, did they? Everyone immediately got on the post Elvis train.
Yeah. Do you remember when we talked about Josie and the Pussycats? There's a gag in that film I love where the boy band dies in a plane accident. That
Mm.
they've orchestrated. They say, like, take the Chevy to the levee. they,
Yeah,
as code for, like, crash this plane. And the
yeah,
news item announcing their death is like, the record company is releasing a deluxe box set of all their songs will be on shelves tomorrow. And it's like
yes,
it's a very sick joke, but it starts. You said about, you can draw a line from Colonel Tom to the start of modern PR, and that's it, isn't it? It's the
yeah,
commodification of all this. Because, like, to talk about, like, how we respectively came to Elvis. Like, for me, just with where I was, it's
yeah.
kind of the return of the commodification of him in, like, the early 2000s. That
Mm,
album, that Junkie XL remix of A Little Less Conversation. Like,
yeah.
One Night's becoming the 1000th UK #1 single in 2005. It's a good pub quiz question, that, because no one thinks it's Elvis had the 1000th UK #1 single in 2005. Disney gave him the jukebox musical treatment with Lilo and Stitch. It's
Oh,
it's
yeah,
it's all in there, and it all brings people to the music. And however you discover music is fine, as we've always said when we're talking about this. But there's the perception of Elvis and his entire life story is like this: is Elvis Presley was a simple truck driver from America, but one day in the 1950s he invented rock and roll. Elvis became famous, and they forced him into the army. Then he came out, and 10 years later came back with a comeback special. Elvis was back, and from until his death he played Las Vegas, and once again became the king of rock and roll. That's literally the script for the 3 ages of Elvis bit from the Competition Time episode of Father Ted. And it works as a gag because from The Simpsons to whatever, to Father Ted, you are just watching this pop culture version of
yeah,
this person. And, like, how could a straight biopic ever have worked? I know there have been, like, the film I want to get around to watching, and I pretty much, like, I'm not a completist with John Carpenter, even though he's one of my favorite directors. I more or less watch one new one per year and ration them out. I'm aware that he did
yeah.
a 1979 TV movie with Kurt Russell as
Kurt
Elvis, like, directed
Russell,
between
yeah,
Halloween and The Fog. So I know I've got to eventually see what the fuck that looks like.
yeah.
Incidentally, Pat Hingle played Colonel Tom, and that's not Kevin
That's
Costner.
good.
But yeah, that's going to be what I watch. But it's this thing of, there's movies about, you mentioned Elvis impersonators. In
Yeah,
2010, Guinness said that there's as many as, the world record for the most impersonated singer, or whatever, one of these frivolous things, what you would think would just be incalculable. But they estimated between 250,000 to 400,000 Elvis impersonators active in the world. I don't think they're just counting when people just go, "Thank you very much," but people doing
yeah,
that. People doing that as an act, but, like, if it was 250,000, that would be enough. Like, I can't really think to where there's the urban legend of, him going to an Elvis lookalike competition and placing
yes,
third. That could be, it's kind of apocryphal. There's the Charlie Chaplin thing that's possibly drawn from, and it's just been
yeah,
bastardized over the years. But whether it's true or not, how many how many other singer lookalike competitions can you feasibly have? You know, it's
Well, yeah. No, that's the thing. I mean, I'm glad you mentioned this idea of where we came to Elvis, because in my case it was during the 90s, and I think looking back, I can see it's almost like as you said, a 3 ages of post Elvis that we're looking at here, where after he died, there was this incredible outpouring of grief, and that's where you got a lot of the sort of the kitschy bits about the Elvis myth kind of solidified, because
yeah.
everyone was too sad to say, hang on, that's a bit stupid. Hang on, we don't need that many Elvis impersonators. Hang on, he didn't really fake his own death. It's not, it became impolite to say this. And by the 90s, there was enough distance that people could actually say, no, this is just kitsch, this is silly. And people, as pendulums do, it swung
Mm,
too far in the other way. People sort of began dismissing his legacy, making jokes about him being a fat bloke who died on the toilet. And then, as you say, I think particularly that noughties single reissue program, because it did start right from the very start of his career. It did start with That's All Right. And I
yeah.
think people like me, who had grown up with this image of Elvis as this ridiculous kind of icon of kitsch Americana, heard
Mm.
how stripped back and authentic that early music sounded and thought, hang on, there's something a bit more here. There's something we dismissed. I just want to say, when we're talking about the kitsch years of Elvis, there is a fantastic documentary which is up on iPlayer now by James Marsh, who did Man on Wire and The Theory of Everything,
Yeah.
called The Burger and the King, which is a history of Elvis through the food he ate.
Wow.
And it's it is taking sort of as its entire subject one of the aspects of Elvis that people laughed at most, but strangely, it does end up becoming quite a viable biopic. It goes right back to the beginning, where his food at this point is like fried squirrel, because it's the only meat they can get during the Great Depression. And it makes a lot of the same points that this movie does about him being rooted in those depression years, and his later excess being the work of a man who constantly had that fear in the back of his mind that it could all go away tomorrow. But it makes it in this very roundabout way. I think it's a really interesting companion piece to this film.
Yeah, like for that reason and the sheer like the amount of impersonators,
Yeah,
Austin Butler wouldn't work in this if it was just an impression. Like
yeah, yeah,
I don't know. Like I think that this is if it has legitimately like affected his voice. I know that like Colin Farrell had vocal problems after doing the King's Speech and things like that. It's
mm-hmm.
another Oscar campaign. Never mind, I might be very gullible. My point being, whether it is like having trouble with this or the rest of it, it's something that is a heart and soul performance, but it's not an
Definitely.
impression. Like it's definitely performance. And much as the 2000s kind of like revival of the songs themselves are still a repackaging. Like mashing it up with getting Junkie XL to do an arrangement of it is still something to
Yeah,
sell Elvis music. Which
yeah,
incidentally, the other thing that in all of these brilliant deals that Colonel Tom the Snowman did, he sold the back catalogue to RCA at one point, like in 1973, I think. So basically, the Presley family estate would get nothing from any recordings made from
right.
1973. This was later used in court to prove that Colonel Tom did not have Elvis's best interests at heart. And,
Yeah, hard
you
to
know,
disagree with that.
yeah. While I'm on the subject, the line at the end of the film where he's talking to Priscilla about how he wanted to make a great movie and he never got to make a
Yeah,
great movie, and they mention A Star Is Born, and he's like, Barbara and the Colonel. It's
yeah.
reduced to this. What actually happened? The actual story of Barbara Streisand wanting Elvis to be in A Star Is Born, because it's like this is post Funny Girl, post Hello Dolly. She's kind of already like big rising star in Hollywood. Once
Yeah,
wanted Elvis to play the male part in the remake of A Star Is Born. John Peters, her partner at the time, was also producing it, and they had met with Elvis in 1974. And according to his entourage, he said there and then, "I'm going to do it. I want to do it."
yeah.
Colonel Tom later on in 1993, he claimed that Elvis never wanted to do it and instructed him to give such a hard contract they could never agree to it. The contract here
Mm.
including $1 million up front, 50% of the box office profits, a piece of the soundtrack profits, approval of all the songs, top billing for Elvis, who hadn't been in a movie in 5 years, and first class transport and 100 grand a week in expenses. He also reportedly questioned what John Peters was bringing to the table, possibly because Game recognises Game. But
Yes.
this was they tied them up in knots, and they just obviously couldn't accept that, and they went to Chris Christopherson instead, and it's become one of those what if things all these years. It is a thing of, at this point, Elvis's health was declining, as it was already. Like Barbra Streisand's acknowledged that, perhaps not in the kindest way of putting it, but when she went to see him, he was overweight, and it was like, oh, you'd be perfect for this. But from his point of view, obviously, A Star Is Born is a fact in pop culture by this point, and he was a fan of the film as it was. And yeah, it's just a throwaway line at the end, and again, it feeds in. Knowing all of this isn't necessary to feed into how desperately sad that last line delivery is from Butler.
I mean, there's a sort of relief in it too, as well, because there is every possibility that having John Peters and Tom Parker on the same movie set would have created a sort of black hole of greedy arseholeness that would have destroyed the planet.
We'd have had a film about the making of that film. I'm fairly sure.
Yes.
Maybe that's what Bradley Cooper did it in Licorice Pizza anyway. That might have been what he did instead of remaking The Star Is Born again. Another bit of we're talking about Colonel Tom and the horrors of all of this. Would you like to hear the
Sure.
silver lining? That bit of trivia that I think is a nice silver lining. The silver lining, as usual, is Dolly Parton. Dolly Parton was, at the top of the charts in America with Jolene and I Will Always Love You in 1974. And Presley wanted to cover I Will Always Love You. He's dead interested in doing it. Colonel Tom gets involved. Said to her, Elvis will have half the rights to this song in perpetuity if he covers it. And even though it broke her heart, she refused. And when Whitney Houston covered it in the 1990s, as we've discussed in the episode about The Bodyguard, she made enough money to buy Dollywood and do incalculable charity work for people in severe poverty. So if there's a final girl in Colonel Tom's rampage across the music industry, it's a good thing that it's Dolly Parton.
That is lovely. Yeah, that is wonderful. I think that's probably a fine point to end off. Is there? Is there any other things you'd like to say before we close off?
Yeah, just that if you're listening by this point, you're not bothered about spoilers because it's Elvis's life. You're fairly sure you know what happens in Elvis's life. But if you think the trailer is like, eternity, and you're going to go down there and sing a Christmas song, or I'll put you $8 million in debt, but I want to wiggle, and like that kind of thing. give it a go. It's more to it. That's what I'm saying. Both of us came to this skeptical for one reason or other, is what I'm saying, and. Yeah, I was glad you enjoyed it. I thought we might have to have an episode, but I wondered if we'd be arguing more.
No, I was so converted that I found myself afterwards thinking, what musical artist should Baz Luhrmann make a biopic of next? I think he could really do wonders with Joy Division.
Have at
it. Yes. But yeah, it was a remarkably pleasant surprise. Whereabouts on the internet, having muffed your intro for the purposes of a joke, Mark, whereabouts can people find your work?
I'm a writer and occasional quizmaster on filmstories.co.uk, in Film Stories magazine, Vodzilla, and on Yahoo Movies UK occasionally.
Nice.
Yeah. I think that about covers it. Bad jokes on Twitter at mharrison90.
Well, at time of recording, Twitter still exists.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. Well, if you enjoyed this, you can get a bonus episode of this show every month by donating to our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Geek Show, where you'll also find reviews of Asian films that don't have a UK distributor, my X-Files reviews, and our other movie podcasts, including From the Video Aisle, where we look back at cult movie franchises, and Last Night, where we just talk about any old shit we've watched. I mean, it's pretty wild. It's good. It's good. Last Night, I had great fun being on it. But we will be back. We'll have. depending on when this episode goes out, we should have a new Patreon episode straight after this. And I have something I want it to be, but I don't want to jinx it. But if you go to www.patreon.com/The Geek Show, you'll find out what it is. And if you don't, well, we'll see you in a fortnight's time with more Pop Screen. But until then, I've been Graham.
I've been Mark. Thank you very much.